Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Nooreen, and I am delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion on race and privilege. Sorry, I'm just getting myself organized here. Just so that you know, this session is being recorded, so that anyone who was not able to be here today will have that opportunity to do so. And as we get going, maybe we could switch to the next slide. To start, I would like to acknowledge that I personally, right now, sitting in Langford, I'm on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees families, so therefore I'm sitting on the same traditional lands as Royal Roads University sits, and I'm very grateful and honored to be on these lands, especially right now as we embark on this very important conversation about how does privilege and how does race fit into our everyday lived experience. So I thank all the families that have come before me on these lands, and I look forward to sharing some of the conversations that have been happening with those families with all of you this afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this session is being recorded, and I'm sure some questions are going to come up as you listen to our panelists. And what I'd like you to do is to share the questions in the chat, because as you will have noted, your microphones are muted. And please engage in ways that are respectful and sensitive to the perspective and views of other participants. I'm happy to say that you can also follow the conversation on Twitter using hashtag RRU discussion. And we have an on-call counselor who is able to meet people in a special breakout room if needed. To access the counselor, please private message Gwen Camden, and she will invite you into that room to have the chance to speak with our counselor. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. So first of all, we have Athena with us, who is the assistant professor within the School of Humanitarian Studies. We have, do we have Elizabeth with us this afternoon? Okay, I think perhaps Elizabeth is not here, but Ruth is here this afternoon as the RAHA representative. We have Russ, who is our Indigenous Student Services Coordinator and Indigenous Education Advisor. Joining us on the panel is also Sophia, who is the Associate Director for CTET, as well as an Associate Faculty for School of Education and Technology. So, how the panel is going to work, how the discussion is going to work, is that I will invite each of the panelists to share their perspective on a couple of particular questions that we pose to give an overview and an introduction to this overall discussion. And then after each of the panelists have shared, then we are going to be able to take your questions, which, as I said, would be great if you would pop into the chat. So I would like to, first of all, share the questions with you so that, you have an idea of how we are framing this discussion. The questions are: how can we continue to raise awareness and keep alive conversations about racial tensions that move us closer to living diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are we called to do as individuals and as a community? How can we leverage the accentuated need to peacefully protest with creative actions that lead to positive change? So with that, I'd like to invite Athena to start us off and in a 2-minute synopsis, give us her views on those questions. Thank you, Athena.
Okay, thank you, Nooreen. And my comments that I've prepared for the opening are about 2 minutes, 40 seconds. I hope that's okay. So just as a backdrop, as Nooreen has indicated, there are two contexts that are grounding my remarks and thinking here, and I appreciate everyone who has been joining us today, and for those who will listen in the recording in the future. So first, we know that there's the backdrop of George Floyd, the movement of Black Lives Matter, where protesters were last seen in these numbers in the civil rights movement in 1968. We also know the backdrop of how that movement has gone global and its impact has been taken up at this institution. So I'm cognizant that I'm only one voice in a conversation that probably requires many more voices and many more opportunities to meet. And I'm cognizant that I'm performing today in just one role amidst a multiplicity of roles and identities. So here's what I hope in response to these questions and conversation today. I'm hopeful that these conversations can continue. I'm hopeful that myself and my colleagues here on this panel can speak their minds and their experiences and not fear reprisal. I'm hopeful that other Black and brown bodies can speak their experiences to open and listening hearts, not only today, but beyond, when the spectacularness of these protests go away, when the 22 seconds of silence is performed, or when the 8 minutes and 46 seconds run out, when the next news cycle hits, when protesters remain home and no longer demand space for their voices to be heard, I hope space continues to be held. I hope that marginalized voices may be categorized as worthy, not categorized as too angry or too emotional or too preoccupied or questioned for their institutional fit, and not asked to share emotional pain without taking up actionable, meaningful steps towards change in the systems that actively suppress their potential. I'm hopeful that we can start questioning, start today. In addition to what can we do, we can thoughtfully reflect, why has there been such a sustaining of the status quo? What has my own individual part been in sustaining it? I'm hopeful that we can reframe the narrative, let's acknowledge now that systemic racism exists, to instead the question, why have I not been actively working to dismantle it? And I'm hopeful I'm hopeful that conversations can be about, why would this collective anger be happening? How can we make space to hear these voices instead of, this anger is making me uncomfortable? And I'm hopeful for those things because none of the things that people have been talking about, that they've been protesting since the death of George Floyd, have been new. The social contract between white bodies and Black and brown and Indigenous bodies did not just become broken last week. It was broken long before, and it's just reached a new tipping point that we are trying to capitalize, and as you say, Nooreen, build momentum on. So I'm hopeful that until the people of the majority and of privilege are able to have honest, open-hearted conversations with themselves about their discomfort and about their complicities, we are going to have these conversations again. And we need to do better. I hope today is a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Athena. Thank you. And Russ, what are your thoughts?
Bonjour, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to share this space with my fellow panelists and for all of you that have had the chance to be in this virtual sort of environment with which we're engaging, especially during these tumultuous times that we find ourselves in. I find these questions interesting. There's no doubt about it. And I think that idea of how can we continue to raise awareness and keep alive our conversations about racial tensions is an interesting one for me. I think some of the things that we think about in this space is a personal relationship to what these things are and the systems with which we find ourselves operating in, and the results of the systems that we've created and that we value and uphold on our daily basis, in the way that we do things and how we approach things. I think it's interesting with COVID-19 and some of the things that the environment that's created, as far as siloing ourselves to a certain extent, has really given us a chance to reflect and to think about what is our relationship to all of these things. From an Indigenous knowledge perspective, we look at it as a relational ontology, that all of this is interconnected, that all things, from the waters to the grasses to the animals to the air to everything, is seen in an equity, in an equitable, sort of worldview and set of ideologies. For us, there is no reliance on such a heavy hierarchy within the systems that govern our way of being and knowing. And so these are interesting questions when I think of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. These things are embedded in my worldview and way of being. I think sometimes the issue with that is that they're not always honored in the spaces with which I have the opportunity to engage and be in. And I think, when we think about that concept of the individual, you have to develop a relationship to these issues and understand and self-locate yourself within what is going on. Why are they happening? Who am I within these things? How are they affecting me? What worldview do I bring to this? How am I affected by all aspects that create the inequity that we're seeing? And I think as we move forward, yourself as an individual, who you are with your family, how you interact with your community, and ultimately from a much wider sort of global sense, they're all interrelated, they're all connected. And I think that first sort of big piece is understanding who you are in all of these things and figuring out what it is that you can do in the spaces that you occupy and with the skill set that you were given. So I'll leave it at that for now. Miigwech.
Thank you, Russ. And unfortunately, our panelist from the student representative was not able to get into the room. We are definitely having some technical difficulties, so I apologize for that. And so I'll pass the baton to Sophia, please.
Thank you, Nooreen. So I want to first acknowledge that I'm sitting on the ancestral lands of the Songhees families. I'm in Bear Mountain. And I just want to express my gratitude for being able to sit here in this space. As the technology has shown us today, we have to be responsive as a community. We have to be able to adapt quickly to change in order for things to continue, right? That's what we had to do today with our technology challenges. One of the things that I did, like when I was preparing for this, because I really struggled with participating, and my struggles and discomfort with this, I know are rooted in two things. One is that I don't feel I can speak in this space with this topic and with the emergence of the call for peaceful protest without bringing in some of my personal feelings, some of my personal questions. And so my discomfort was really rooted in that I can't disconnect my personal from my professional in this space. The other thing that stood out for me as I was preparing, I had written out some words that I was going to share, and I've decided not to read them for some reasons that I'm still kind of questioning. I think part of it is because I wanted to figure out how I could be responsive in this space and be authentic and be real. And at the same time, I feel challenged. One of the things that I wrote as I was preparing for this was the fact that I felt like I didn't have the ability to be vulnerable, and I didn't have the courage to speak in this space. And so that's an eye-opening thing for me, to think about someone that feels like they are so empowered because, I've got education and I've got titles behind my name. But at the same time, I still feel very much disempowered, which is a really interesting thing. The other thing that I want to say is that I really think that we need to think about what is happening right now. We need to be critical. We need to also question our intentions. And when I say question our intention, I'm speaking to my fellow Black sisters and brothers. I'm speaking to other folks who have been racialized and who have experienced discrimination in any way, shape, or form. And then I'm speaking to individuals who are coming from positions of privilege. we need to really be critical about our intentions when we're in this space, because right now there is so much potential for herd and mob mentality to emerge in this space. And if we adhere to that, we are not going to move forward, and we are not going to meet with change, because once the mob disassembles, you are there alone. And so you have to know, you have to really be rooted in the truth and at the core of why you are joining and why you are uniting with this conversation, why you're raising your voice today. It has to come from the core, and you have to understand what is really fueling this conversation. It's about inequality. It's about oppression. And as much as we don't want to use those words, it's really hard to hear those things. It's hard for me to say that there is still marginalization, there is still disempowerment, there is still oppression in our spaces. It's very hard to say that. It's hard to hear it, but it's harder for me to say it. And so the last thing that I want to say is that we need to remember in these conversations that there are folks who are struggling, who are dealing with some serious issues in terms of their emotional stability, their courage, their spiritual connections. There's so many different things that are happening, and we need to really approach this understanding that there is huge vulnerability involved in this conversation. And with huge vulnerability, it calls for respect. Respect. We have to be respectful, and we have to listen. We have to listen and stop defending. We have to listen and stop making excuses. We have to just listen. So that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. Wow, 3 very passionate introductions, and we are listening to you who are here in this call. And if you would like to make a comment, or especially to ask a question that we can pose to the panel, please just put that into the chat box, and then we can take it from there. And while we're just waiting for people to do that, one of the things that I just heard Sophia said was about the mob mentality, and how when the mob disperses, you're left there alone. And that got me to thinking, what can an individual do in this current climate in a creative way to leverage that this momentum that has this momentum in which we find ourselves in this moment? What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what can I do? What is there for me to do? And particularly, what can I do in a creative and sustainable way? Anyone want to share their thoughts on that? Russ, you're smiling. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it's always that, like, everybody waits to be polite. It's like, who's going to do it? But no, I think it's a really interesting question, a question that gets asked a lot when thoughts about allyship and all of those kinds of things. What can I do? All that kind of stuff. And one of the most beautiful things I heard was, love yourself. Treat yourself with love. And I think the root of that idea is that we're all fallible as human beings. We all make mistakes. None of us are perfect, you know. And I think the vulnerability that Sophia is talking about is developing a relationship with those things, and understanding that, you know, privilege, you know, affects us all in different ways. We all have it in some way, shape, or form, and that our understanding of what these issues are opportunities to learn. And, you know, by having the humility and speaking truth to yourself, in our language, Dubwewin, the word for truth actually means to speak with love, you know. And it's that idea that you're going to constantly be growing, you're constantly going to be making mistakes, and you're constantly going to be creating newer and better versions of yourself. And through that, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to screw up. But that's an inevitable piece that the elders always pass on, is that you're going to make mistakes. It's what you do after those mistakes that truly counts. And I think with this stuff, you know, a big piece of that is allowing yourself to be vulnerable, allowing yourself to make mistakes, allow yourself to be taught, allow yourself to be guided. And I think that's where love, I think, is really the key to all of this stuff. But it's hard. There's no doubt about it. You know, sometimes Western values don't value those things quite the same way. And I think, you know, those things are extremely important as we move forward with this work, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Russ. And we've actually had some questions, which are I'd like to move to now. The first one's from Jules. There's a pretty striking call at this moment to reallocate police funding services to alternative services that lead with care and not lethal force. Royal Roads University, historically and specifically, has acted as educators to leaders into justice and policing roles. What is the university, as individuals and as an organization, doing towards this pivot? Maybe Athena, sorry, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Athena, would you like to speak to that?
Can I let you know that Elizabeth is now in the session?
Thanks, Gwen. I'll just
welcome, Elizabeth.
I'll be quick, and then perhaps Elizabeth would like some time.
Yes, thank you.
I can't speak to what the university is doing. I don't know. I'm not part of the university leadership or direction. Within our school, the School of Humanitarian Studies, I would imagine that there are opportunities to look at alternative ways of reconceptualizing police roles in maintaining the peace and not taking on the roles as arbiter for mental health or addictions calls. I think that right now we have conflated the use of force with the call to serve, not universally, but in many instances, and that requires a very systemic change or reallocation at the very least of resources. And I think Jagris Hodson yesterday, I was in a meeting where she mentioned the police force in many municipalities get de-escalation training, get mental health training, and yet we are still seeing repetition of violence and police brutality against Black bodies. So I don't know, perhaps that's something we can take forward to positions of leadership within the university, but I think that's a very apt and useful one. I'll turn the time over for Elizabeth, who's joined us.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Nooreen, for you to turn that on.
That's okay. Thanks, Athena. Hi, welcome, Elizabeth. Nice that you could join us. We're in the process right now of just taking some questions, but I'd like to go back and ask you to share your thoughts on those opening questions that we were all given beforehand, if you would be so kind.
Sure. To me, I believe it's still about education, to be honest, because no matter how we keep saying we're in an era where there's privilege of the internet and you can get educated, some people don't see the need to actually go the extra mile in actually educating themselves. So it's actually left to you to actually, if you meet someone, for instance, I was at work the other day and a lady came and I was like, oh, I love your hair. I have a coworker who's from Africa. And as we all know, Africa is a continent and not a country. So in instances like that, we have to keep educating and saying, thank you. And then you actually have to explain to them that is a continent, like Australia and the rest. And there are 52 countries within that continent. And you have to let them know politely so that they actually do understand where the mistake is coming from and try to do better. So I believe we as a community need to strive to actually continuously educate people. Sometimes it may get really draining with educating people because you feel I've educated enough, but nothing is changing. But we do still have to try to still educate if we want that change for us and for our people and even for our children and the greater good of the Black community as a whole. I do believe we still have to stick to educating people that are not aware of the Black race, our struggles, what we've been through, how we're trying to change to become the better us and for a brighter tomorrow. So that's what I believe.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. And I'd like to move to another question from Jagris. And her question is, Royal Roads University is a former military school, and both the academic and military cultures are part of white supremacy in Canada. What would you like to see RRU look like in the future? And how can we do better to dismantle these toxic cultures?
I would say it's all about diversity and having like an intertwined curriculum as well, because I do understand that I came to this country to learn from them, and they already do have their curriculum which they've actually built over the years. But in taking the extra mile to actually have like an intertwined curriculum about the Indigenous people, the Black struggles, or like even the Indian people, or just different people and how they've come, where they've come from, and so that it gives people like a different idea of like, because we've all had like prejudice of different people from what we've seen in movies without actually learning, like getting to know them. And that's what movies have taught us over the years. So I believe if the curriculum actually is diverse and we have a lot of diversity within the school, and we even have events that actually speak on diversity, like every week is dedicated to like a country or dedicated to like a specific group of people within the school, and to just showcase their culture, what they stand for, what they believe in. And we can't really change the fact that the school is built of, the school was a military camp before. We can't change that fact. It's there, but it's left for us now to start changing and making Royal Roads a better place for everyone to be able to stay in and live as one. So like having different events from now, like at different times, to just educate people on like different cultures, I believe that would go like a long way. And having like extracurricular activities with like curriculum of like different cultures, I believe that's going to go a really long way.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Sophia, what are your thoughts? What would you like to see RRU look like in the future? And how can we do better to dismantle these toxic cultures?
Yes, thanks, Jagris, for a very tough question. How do we dismantle culture? Like that is a very challenging thing to do. Because so much of culture isn't necessarily something that is formally taught, if you will. Right? We learn so many things in so many subtle ways. There are so many subtleties. You know, so how do we dismantle the subtleties, the things that are, you know, below the surface, if you will? That's a really challenging thing to do. I don't want to sound though like a pessimist, right? I'm very hopeful that we are going to move closer to being better. And I believe that if we are going to be serious though about our movement towards really embracing, I would say, inclusion and equity as our priority, because I don't think diversity is enough, because we can be very diverse and very exclusive at the same time. So I think if we're going to be serious, then we're going to have to start really being serious, and we're going to have to start seeing these movements towards inclusion and equity show up in invisible ways. So we need to see it reflected in the people. We need to see it reflected in the spaces. We need to see it reflected in, like Elizabeth said, the curriculum. We need to see it reflected in the things that we value. And it's gonna take a lot of work, and we are gonna be tired. We're gonna have to keep going at this. I really think it's down to the personal commitment. Like Russ talked about, the interrelationships and the connectedness of everything. We need to start by looking at our personal commitment. What do we do in our everyday life to move us closer to this? You know, So that's a tough question. Conversations like this can open the door, but we need action, and we need to have voices coming to the table. We need to have marginalized voices. We need to have voices of folks who've experienced discrimination. We need to have voices of folks who've lived this at the table to make the call on what we need to do. We need to be included.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Sophia. Athena, you had raised your hand. Would you like to comment?
Sure. Sophia mentioned a lot of things that I was thinking. So just briefly, I do agree with both Russ and Sophia and Elizabeth in that education is important. The personal space that we inhabit and that reflection and how we interact with others is important. But I also think we need, as the question suggests, systemic change. We can examine our policies because we know that, I mean, a policy that perpetuates racial inequalities, intended or not, is racist. So we can take the stance of saying, well, I'm going to actively be an anti-racist. I will listen and help promote marginalized voices. We can create roles where people of color inhabit space amongst leadership to reflect the diversity that we seek to create. Those are first reasonable and good steps. And I think we're all here to support those steps. But I think it requires a reimagining and retooling of who we are and reflecting on institutionally what that means.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Thanks, Athena. And we had a question that I think I will pose to Russ. Has there been any consideration to make Indigenous perspectives a core class for every undergrad or master's program at Royal Roads?
That's a great question. It's interesting to see how Western institutions are developing relationships with Indigenous knowledge systems within academia. You see some that are making mandatory courses. You're seeing others that are trying to interweave it into the curriculum that exists. At Royal Roads, we've had discussions about the direction that we want to take with these things, but at the same time, we are right now doing our best to interweave them into what we have created. You know, when we look back at sort of a relational ontology, what are we creating by forcing people to take these things and making them mandatory? How does that create, or what kind of relationship does that create by forcing, you know, engagement in these spaces? And as far as, you know, looking at interweaving it, then we're taking, or we're looking at rooting that relationship in a desired process, right? You know, students that want to study certain aspects of, you know, whatever it may be, communication or, you know, business or whatever that may be, there's already a growing relationship to those things. So if we can find a way to bridge Indigenous knowledge systems with their desire to learn and integrate those into what they're already working towards, it, I think, can create a better sort of discourse with the material and relationship to, you know, what it is that we want them to take away coming away from those spaces. I'm not saying that, you know, we're 100% on either one, but right now, you know, our discussions have leaned more towards interweaving it into some things. But, you know, having said that, our relationship with Indigenous knowledge at Royal Roads is developing, right? I mean, we're on the newer side of an institution. This hasn't been something that has been at the forefront of what Royal Roads does, and we can look to the history of what the institution has been and will be in the past. And so one of the things that I look forward to in the position that I have the honor of holding is, how are we going to develop this? You know, what is it that we're going to create? Because we have this ability here with almost a clean slate to develop and create pertinent courses and engagement as we move forward with these things. And I think Royal Roads is in a wonderful position to be able to integrate those things into the work that they've already done while creating new spaces to engage those things moving forward. And that excites me. It really does.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Russ. And again, turning to our chat box, I would just like to share something that Kenny wrote. Something I would like to see at Royal Roads is an anti-racism orientation program for all members of the faculty as well as for students. Despite people not intending to hurt others, many individuals lack cultural sensitivity to realize that their messages and thoughts oppress other members of the class. And Leona shares, there has been a lot of information and resources for white people to take the steps to dismantle the current systems. Example, white fragility, me and white supremacy, etc. However, these are subsections within the BIPOC communities that have sided with power and have contributed to these systems. Being a person in the BIPOC community doesn't exempt us from breathing in these same systems. Are there any resources that are specific to the BIPOC community so that we do not have to contribute to eating our own virtue of the conditioning and socialization of the systems created by white supremacy delusions? Anyone on the panel care to speak to that? Yes, Athena.
I can speak briefly to it, and it links in also to Kenny's comments, which thank you both for those comments. So first, Leona's question about resources for the BIPOC communities. I belong to a Facebook group where there have been some posted. I can't multitask and look at those, so I can try to post those after I finish this preamble. But I also think that there are academic contributions within the literature of internalized oppressions that we are seeing very relevant in your comment here. It's internalizing the narratives that have been thrust upon us by, or have been thrust upon minoritized bodies, in this instance, the BIPOC body, and not feeling empowered to take up your own space otherwise. And linking to Kenny's comment, and I appreciate that anti-racism within the anti-racist toolkit, we can also learn that there is race-based data collection. And I have a bunch of stats that can contribute to the understanding of systemic oppression. But unique to Canada, Ontario is the only province that consistently takes race or collects race-based data. And I think that would help us to be able to articulate the oppressions that exist. I know for me personally, some of the stats that spoke to me are, I'm a female Asian Pacific Islander. I'm the least likely to get pulled over by police. So the police brutality against Black bodies I may not understand, but what I do understand and resonate with is that I'm 8 times more likely to be randomly checked at immigration control, and my demographic further suggests, according to research, according to the data that's collected in Ontario, that I will have the least representation in positions of leadership and be the least likely to be acknowledged commensurate to my educational achievements. So hearing those data points really made me feel like I was able to articulate some of the things that I was feeling. Specific to the BIPOC communities, I'll link back to you with some resources that have been distributed, but I think that we should also, not only this one community, but all of us, I think as Russ mentioned in his preamble as well, we have contributed to our own oppressions, perhaps as a result of the narratives that have been imposed on us, and perhaps as a result of not feeling empowered to be able to speak to our own authentic voices, but it's still part of the same system. And I think we're struggling and grappling with these questions together, or hopefully at least alongside. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Athena. Are there any other thoughts to share? Elizabeth, please.
I don't really have anything with regards to that question. I was just listening to Athena, and I was actually agreeing with her on like the stats that we do need in like the various provinces in Canada, because she said, I believe it's just in Ontario that they do have those stats that actually on like the racial demographics in each state. And I believe it would be helpful to actually have each provinces or each city have their own stats on like the racial demographics within the society, so it can actually help us progress. I believe, I feel like having that is actually a step into acknowledging that there's actually a lot of diversity, enough like people in the city to actually progress, to actually learn to know about. Because me coming into Victoria, for instance, with what I see, I believe that there's just the most the demographics here, like the Caucasian, the Chinese, I believe, and then the Indians. And I know there are like more people in Victoria, but without the stats being present, is what I see is what I tend to believe. And I know that's very shallow for me to speak, but that's what I see, and that's what I'm going to act on. But I believe if the city actually provides stats for us, we'll learn to actually, I feel like that's a step moving forward to actually having a brighter future for everyone to be included. Because I believe it's inclusivity that we're all fighting for, and our voices to be heard at the table with regards our gender, with regards our race, with regards our sexual orientation or what we believe in. So I think that's actually going to be a step forward in actually having us belong to the same table, sort of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to remind people to, you can place your questions into the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'd just like to read a comment from Michelle. In the MAIIC, I studied how interculturalism is taught to children through storybooks. First, there is no shelf in the library for intercultural studies in children's storybook. There are intercultural books that intermingle with storybooks, and unless you can look at the cultural codes to determine how interculturalism is taught, there needs to be a designated shelf in the library. I'm talking the local library, not the RRU library. So that's certainly something, and Michelle had earlier said, bridging Indigenous materials with the environment, for example. Yes, speaking to what Russ had commented on earlier. And there are programs at RRU to teach intercultural communications with exception to Indigenous cultures, right? So there's still a lot of work that we ourselves in the Royal Roads community need to look at very, very closely and very critically as we move forward.
Hi, Nooreen, I'm wondering if I can interject.
Please do, yes.
I would really like to put a question out to the audience, just because I don't know who we're speaking to. So I'm going to borrow something. So I went downtown to the gathering on Sunday that was led by some young, very young leaders in our Victoria community. And there were a lot of people in the gathering, a lot of very different bodies in the audience. But there was a question that was asked. It was basically, if you are Black, can you put your fist in the air? So I want to ask that, and you can't put your fist in the air. I can't see you all. I'm gonna just ask, if you are a Black person, can you just type yes in the chat? So this is just an example, right, of our community and who makes up our community. There are 100 people in the room. If you are a person who identifies as being a person of color, can you put yes in the chat? Or any other racialized group, can you put yes in the chat?
My people. I'm just happy to see this. Thank you.
The reason I asked is I just remember standing there in Centennial Square on Sunday with all of these people around me. And when I was asked to put my fist in the air, and I saw other fists in the air, it was such an amazing feeling and experience. I don't know if any of you were there, but it was amazing. And so for me, having an opportunity for folks out there who are listening to us share, to have an opportunity to also experience that there are others in this space with you. And I don't want to disclude. So I'm going to say, if you are in support of this movement towards the elimination of discrimination and racism, put a yes in the chat. I don't think I have to say anything else. Thank you so much.
That was awesome, Sophia. Thank you. Thanks for that. And wow, there's a lot of yeses there. And in that vein of typing into the chat, please feel free to ask a question or make a comment. Sorry, I'm just looking there. And we've got a few minutes left for 15 yeses in Collaborate. Okay. I would like to ask if you could just share some closing comments to round out this discussion. We started with some very, very powerful personal messages from the four of you, and we've had some responses to some of the questions, and it would be nice to just round out that. But wait, before we do that, I'd just like to read Kenny's comment in the chat. To go back to Russ's point, Royal Roads University is an institution in which professionals from many backgrounds come to learn from the faculty and from others' experience. I believe it is essential for professionals and practitioners to develop anti-racist critical thinking. Without understanding systemic oppression, students do not develop the appropriate toolkit to fight the oppression in their professional spaces. Yes, indeed. So with that, I invite you to just share some closing comments, some closing thoughts, what you would like to leave us to ponder and to think about as we go forward and continue these conversations. So perhaps I can start with you, Elizabeth.
For me personally, because coming from like a very diverse, can you hear me? Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Oh, sorry, I thought the network just went off. Coming from like a background, like originally I'm from Nigeria, but I moved to England when I was young. So I've had like different experiences in different places. And for me, because inclusivity is what I've been fighting for the longest of time now. And one thing I've learned through all my journey of actually fighting for my voice is in the spirit of actually educating yourself and striving to be better. Like, you can't just leave the fact that movies are telling you this, music are telling you this, or like, because one of my classes I had this last term, a teacher spoke about canceling the belief that when you have a person from Nigeria, for instance, you make me the ambassador of the country. I'm just one person from Nigeria, so I do not have the different lifestyle that everyone in Nigeria has lived. So I can't speak for the whole of Nigeria, and I can't speak for the whole of Africa. So I believe if we as individuals try to actually educate ourselves and to not just leave it to the belief of one person we branded as the ambassador of the country, or from what we learn as movies, I believe we'll actually go a long way in life. And I believe education is the first step to actually take in having inclusivity in our society, and acknowledging the different groups within the society and actually paying respect and homage to them. For instance, the Indigenous people, the founders of the land, and paying respect to them anytime we want to actually begin an event is actually something. Coming to Canada, I've actually applauded, because actually paying homage to the people of the land. And that I found to be really amazing. And with RRU, I believe it's just about, like, with the curriculum and what Sophia said, just making because we do have a long way to go. I'm not going to lie to you. I believe this is the first step, but we do have a long way to go, because we've had several years of drawbacks. So I believe we do need to take active steps as individuals and as an organization and as a community to make our future actually better, and the divide within our communities to actually be something of the past. So, yeah.
Now I'm muted. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, for that. Yeah. So again, can we go to Russ to share your closing thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. Elizabeth Miigwech, for your words, as always, and thank you for joining us. I know you had some difficulties getting in, but what a wonderful, I'm so glad you made it, and it's so wonderful to hear your voice up here. You know, I'm a decolonial scholar, so I have an interesting relationship to colonization in the way that it has affected, you know, I guess mainly Indigenous people, but also with an understanding that we have all been colonized in some way, shape, or form. You know, all of us are here in a different space than perhaps our ancestors had been brought upon, you know, and from an Indigenous way of being and knowing, it's the land that has created our language, our way of being, and our way of interacting and being in relationship to all things. And somewhere down the line, we have lost touch with our relationship to those traditional spaces that brought up our ancestors and brought our teachings along with us. And I think, you know, if we can look back at the similarities that we have that have been generated, you know, over millennia of thinking, and we can get back to those values and those things that have rooted us in a good way for a long period of time, and we understand what our relationship to colonization is and how it affects us on a daily basis, we're going to be in a much better position to talk about the things that we're doing, educate ourselves about these issues, but also to take action. You know, education is an important thing. It's a wonderful thing to be educated and to have the privilege to take the time to be educated. But what are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with this knowledge, and how are we going to transition that into wisdom, and how are we going to enact, you know, what it is that we learn and that we spend our time doing? And I think, you know, one of the things about colonization is that it works. You know, it has taught us to not critically think, to not question some things that perhaps we take for granted sometimes. And there's tons of resources out there. There's tons of content. There's tons of, you know, beautiful writers and educators, and you know, Fanon comes to mind, and Googie, you know, Audre Lorde and her poetry. You know, there's so many things that we can tap into that can help shift our perspective and the ideology with which we operate in these spaces. And colonialism is everywhere. It's interwoven into everything. And the more that we understand what our relationship is to that, and figuring out, you know, what it is that we can do as individuals, the skill set that we carry, and who we are, and what we bring to spaces and to our communities, is going to be what gets this ball rolling. And, you know, much like Sophia said, it's taken 400 years for us to get to this stage. It's going to take us many years to shift the dialogue and to change, but it doesn't mean that we don't stop. And it's that wonderful idea that, you know, 7 generations from now, my ancestors are going to have a completely different relationship to all of this. And that's what gets me up every single day. It's those little things that are going to create this ball rolling and continue it, you know, and that's the thing that gives me hope. So to be able to share this space, to have open dialogue, to sit here with these esteemed colleagues, it's an honor. It really is. And we'll keep chipping away at these things for sure. So miigwech, appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Russ. And before I ask Athena and Sophia to share their thoughts, I'd like to just share a comment from Colleen that was in the chat. And what Colleen says is that I think that the one thing that would help to disrupt our university culture to become one of inclusion and equity, as mentioned by a number of the panel members, is for each of us individually to examine our own shadows with respect to how we contribute to the current culture at the university. As a longer-term employee, I have found the university to be hierarchical, careerist, exclusive, and oppressive on many levels. One question I ask myself quite often and recalibrate as the years of my employment increase is, how much of myself can I or do I want to bring to work? How can I be authentic while not alienating whole groups of people? Can I express myself and not feel I have to smile at the baby steps the university takes towards a more inclusive and equitable culture? Lots of food for thought there as well. So turning back, and I do acknowledge that we have gone over time slightly, and I trust that that's all right with our panel, because we did start a little bit late, and just to make sure that everyone has the space to say what is needed to say. Thank you. I see a couple of heads nodding. I appreciate that. Yeah, so Athena, maybe you'd like to share some closing comments with us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate Colleen's thoughts, and also Russ and Elizabeth, your comments as well. To build on those, and I've prepared some closing remarks as well. So what now, what next? Great. We know that we want to imagine and reimagine and transform the current system and our relationships within it. We are aware of an unfair, unjust, and overall, as they say in French, pourri status quo. So the more important question I think that we've discussed and highlighted here is, what is your role that currently, what is our role? What is every individual's role that currently sustains it? And as Sophia said as well, there are a number of different audiences here, and I struggled in preparing my remarks to speak to each of those bodies, or those bodies of people. So first, to the students here at RRU who are here from a number of countries abroad, here for maybe a year or two or three, forging new paths for their families and their communities, learning to navigate a new institution that's not immune to, in light, let's face it, in light of today's backdrop, sometimes some societal norms that can be hostile. So what supports do we offer? How do we ensure that celebrating student diversity is welcomed and that students feel empowered to celebrate their knowledge and their communities? I think of my own college mentors, and I cry every time I think of this. The illustrious Kwame Mackenzie, who was the first psychiatrist in his inner city hospital in London. Sorry, every time I go through this, I cry. I think of the award-winning theater critic, Eric Samuelson, who got excommunicated from his church community for fighting up for LGBTQ rights. So Kwame's ability to form teams, create equity, and his belief in my work directly facilitated the $300,000 in grants I was awarded as a PhD student at University of Toronto. I wish that he would run for office in 2023 because his ability to believe in people and to transform and to mobilize has been truly transformational for me. And Eric, once when we were on a mission in Norway, I remember I was denied admission to some theater performance. He promptly stepped in and in perfect Norwegian had a conversation with the agent about racism and then bought me a ticket. It was located front and center. I didn't realize what a powerful intervention that was until years later, and that helps transform the types of opportunities that I strive to create in my classrooms. I think of these remarkable mentors in my life, one of whom has since died, and one whom I last saw at my wedding. I wonder what mentorship we extend to our students listening today, to those who may be feeling alone and marginalized in your experience. I see you and I hear you. I pledge to do better. And I invite my faculty colleagues to join me in recognizing your journey. Sorry. I think we have a lot to do to join in recognizing your journeys. I also think of my son, Devin, and my fear as a new parent about how to raise him in a world that neither mobilizes nor socializes for kindness. I hope he'll for better. I hope he will continue to feel happy and safe outside of the immediate circle of his loving family. I do hope that he'll continue to cheer on his peers like my colleague Eva Malicius' son is noted to do at his daycare. I hope Devin one day gets taught by someone like Sophia's daughter, who publicly declares herself against hatred and bigotry in all forms and is not afraid to speak out to power. I hope with influences like these built together that my son will grow up confident in his voice, like Sophia's daughter, and the power of the color of his skin. I hope that these conversations that we've had today are just one way of reflecting and of being here at Royal Roads. I invite more spaces and opportunities to reflect honestly and authentically. I hope our leadership and our colleagues commit to engaging with people of color as they move forward. I'm not particularly of the opinion that engaging consultants are the people who ought best lead us. Change has to be more about asking members of your community to share their confessionals. Like Sophia mentioned earlier, Like Russ has mentioned earlier, we are also knowledge keepers. To exclude us in your ongoing action plans and decision-making is more than continued microaggressions that we learnt about in our EDI trainings. That is in fact explicit and continued aggressions that have already been perpetrated against us. So for all of you, faculty, student, staff who are listening today, if you aren't sure how you or your role have time or space to support, start with listening with your heart. Sophia mentioned this earlier, and commit to engaging in this work. There are a lot of sources out there. I'm happy to know that 10 out of the top 15 books being bought online this week are about race and how to dismantle racism according to the people who have lived it. So we have a lot of work to do. Let's get it done. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that heartfelt, for those heartfelt words, Athena.
Sorry, I can't just, yeah.
No, I think you've touched us and you've inspired us, and that was just awesome. Thank you so much. And yes, and with that, I'd like to ask Sophia if she could share some of her thoughts and wisdom with us.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much to my sister, Athena. We connected earlier today. It was touching. Thank you. I think I would describe myself as being someone who really believes in grassroots. And I think that's probably why when we talk about this, I kind of go back to the personal and the individual. And Elizabeth, I agree, we need to make collective steps and we need to make steps as a community. But as Colleen has noted, we need to start with ourselves. We need to start with me first. And we need to critically reflect on our contributions. And even myself, I know that I need to do this too. I need to critically reflect on how I have kept my mouth shut when I observe things happening out of fear of reprimand. We have to be able to engage. If we're going to move forward, we're going to have to make a personal commitment. And I think Athena really ended us on a fantastic note. She gave us so much to think about. And so I'm not going to go on very long. I think all I want to say is we've become socialized to the phrase, I can't breathe. And so as we close out, I'm going to ask you to take 3 breaths. The first one is for social justice. Take a breath for social justice. The second breath I want you to take is for 0 tolerance for racism and discrimination. 0 tolerance. And the third breath I want you to take is for your personal commitment to take action, to speak out when you are witnessing something that you know is wrong, to talk to your children about the importance of inclusion, to talk to your parents and challenge some of the hurtful things you've heard them say, to talk to your friends and challenge them, your colleagues and challenge them. We have to take action. We have to start with us. It is not going to work if we don't do that. So that's what I leave with you today. Take 3 breaths. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Sophia. Thank you so much for that. And I see Elizabeth would like to just say a couple of words before we close.
Yeah, hi. It's not just, I'm not going to say something too much. I'm just going to ask the public and the participants as well, like whoever is watching this, to not make this step of us fighting for inclusivity as a trend, but something we actually want to fight for, because some people are just taking it now, or because everyone is fighting for Black Lives Matter, or fighting for Black lives to be heard. Some people just believe, oh, it's the new trend, why don't I just jump on it? I ask and I plead that we actually don't take it as a trend, but something that's actually happening, and for something we should actually fight for for the greater good, for us to have like peaceful living, for our children to be able to walk the streets safe at night without being scared of if their color would lead to their death. So I would actually like us to actually take a step and actually do it, because we're doing it for ourselves, for our community, for our future jobs, for our future career, for our future kids. Because I, as a Black woman, I'm actually scared of having a Black son into this world, because I don't know what's going to happen to him. He might just be running on the road and then someone decides, oh, he's not supposed to be in this type of community or in this type of neighborhood, and then call the police on him, and that might just lead to something else. So I actually ask, and then I plead that we actually do take active steps, as Russ said, and do not make this another trend of Black Lives Matter, or I have nothing better to do, let me just follow the trend since everyone is doing it. So I do ask, we do recognize the facts, recognize the issues, and take active steps as a person, as individual selves and as communities, to actually solve the problem at hand.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Those are very strong words to end our discussion. And thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you, Elizabeth, Russ, Athena, and Sophia, for being here today, for sharing not only your thoughts and your feelings, but just inspiring us and calling to action and saying that, yes, it starts with me, it starts with us. And there's so much in my head right now. I need to think about a lot of things. And as a woman of color who has witnessed and experienced racism, yes, I hear you. And I think hearing is a critical word here, because as much as I hear you, I want to be heard, we also have to hear all of the other voices that are part of this conversation, part of this discussion, as we move forward into a more positive and better future. And for, as Elizabeth said, so that our children of color can walk safely into the world and know that they are welcomed and included. So thank you to all the participants. Thanks very much for your patience in getting this session going. Yeah, sometimes it does, there are glitches, and in the current world that we live in, hey, this was nothing. I'm glad that we were able to persevere and have this panel discussion. And again, thanks to all the participants. Thanks so much to all of our awesome panelists. And I will just like to end by saying, this is not the end of this conversation. This is just the beginning. Keep on talking, keep on listening. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.